Good morning, this is your host, Ali Hagbayan, reporting in from AriesMediaNetwork. The time currently is 11:06 a.m. on the 31st of March 2023. And today on the Aries Media Network we're going to be discussing my personal opinions and a theory that which I've put together surrounding the current tones and skin colors of human beings from around the world, and how quite possibly through evolution and taking into account religious scriptures, in specifically the flood and Noah's story, when taking all this into account, I've done a fair bit of research in regards to the scriptures that we've got with Noah's flood and all the books that have been removed and the information that's accessible pretty much anywhere other than what's available on mainstream outlets. And this information you will have to go digging for ever since they've started the whole agenda of false information and fact-checking. It's been extremely difficult and hard to come across some of the information that was previously once available, which now at this point is extremely scarce and rare to come across without it being tampered and modified heavily. So the thing I would like to focus on is the exact change and cause and the thing which would be required for this type of extreme change to take place in such a short period of time within the human evolution. To explain for the fact that we have different colours. Personally, my background is in science, if you would like to consider my academic education. The picture you currently see up on the screen is of my graduation at my master's degree in microbiology. This was at Teesside University in the UK. And my background being in science as a scientist, there's specific insight and knowledge I know and expertise that I've gained having worked inside of laboratories and working with bacterium and cellular culture and things along those lines, to where it would suggest that something like Noah's Ark and the Noah's story, if you would like to take a scientific outlook and perspective on it, seems like it would be more likely that if at those times and if Noah had some form of aid, there was technology possibly available to make Noah's Ark something which was in effectiveness a DNA genetic bank, essentially, which would also allow and accommodate for the fact that Noah had to have one of each animal from each species on Earth, a male and a female, in order to be able to reproduce the flora and fauna of the Earth after the flood. And this is more likely and more believable when looking at the fact that Noah's Ark was possibly a genetic bank, and Noah was probably or possibly well educated in genetics and as a scientist in overall. So to suggest that Noah's Ark was a genetic bank and that it was actually DNA which Noah was able to store effectively and make use of after the flood to reproduce humanity and reproduce the flora and the fauna on the earth in order to kickstart nature, it's heavily leaning towards the fact that this could possibly be a truth that may have been hidden from us or may have been completely skewed before being entered into the scriptures, and that's simply because it would allow for any critical thinkers to come to conclusions which would lead them to believe that even the religious scriptures we have today are altered versions of previous scriptures that have been collected and found throughout time and history as a direct evidence and memorial essentially to human evolution and our time here on Earth. Um, it's extremely suggestive that it could have been a DNA genetic bank. It's extremely possible that all the species could be recreated without having to experience any mutations or incestual genetic issues in relation to breeding, which would also explain the whole Adam and Eve story and how we would essentially all be descendants of either Adam and Eve, and somewhere along the line we would expect to have some form of mutation, some form of ancestral genetic, um, disease or disarray, which simply isn't the case because we're still able to, marry, whether it's outside of our race or outside of our culture, in order to be able to keep a diverse genetic bloodline. This would ensure that there is no forms of issues, obviously, other than genetic diseases which could be passed down through bloodlines. Now, having looked at that and considering that Noah's story could mean that Noah was possibly a scientist and a geneticist for that matter, and he dealt with DNA quite possibly, and Noah's Ark was a genetic bank. This would then you could consider the fact that as a scientist, if for example we had a bunch of mice which we were testing on, and we, for example, genetically modified a specific set of them and then had obviously a control sample, in order to differentiate between the control sample and the mice which we've used to actually genetically modify, other than keeping them separate, a great idea would be to actually, for example, graft an luciferase gene to make illuminous glow-in-the-dark mice, which has been done before. And this would allow for differentiation, so that when I actually exposed the mice to UV light, I was able to tell from a group of mice that could be mixed with the control sample which mice in specific and in particular were actually genetically modified. I believe this could be the case for human beings as well. I can understand that quite possibly the black skin colors and skin tones are what is considered to be natural and original to this earth and plane of existence, simply because of the fact that it accommodates for the intense UV radiation of the sun. They're able to handle far more exposure without any risk of repercussions coming directly as a result of that. Whereas on the other hand, people with fairer skin tend to see far higher rates of skin cancer and other forms of UV damage to their skin. And this would be suggestive of the fact that one essentially race of human beings is far more equipped naturally for this earth and this plane of existence than the other. Now, looking at that, if human beings were intentionally changed in color, this would suggest that obviously the scientific intervention and the whole genetic theory with Noah's Ark is again then supported by this, because of the differentiation in skin color between humans, which can be observed around the world. And obviously you'd want to do this to be able to differentiate which humans have what specific changes and what specific qualities they hold and possess. So there's that specific theory, and then on the other hand, I've also considered the fact that if you consider during the floods how some of the giants and some of the people escaped to the mountains and tried to evacuate, essentially to try and dodge effectively the flood, which I imagine did not work for the majority, and maybe possibly according to scripture, some of the fallen angels survived, some of the Nephilim survived, some of the giants survived, which would suggest that it wouldn't be quite far-fetched that some humans also took to, sub-Mediterranean, sub-Saharan caving systems and deep underground caverns to be able to stay alive and actually block themselves off from the surface world in order to stop the water getting into the areas which they were residing in. This also would support the changes and the differentiation we see across the globe in skin tone and color during the flood, simply because of the fact that quite possibly there may have been a break in and separation in communication in different sects and groups of survivors which had managed to survive the flood. Now, the issue this arises is that because they're not able to communicate, one sect in a completely isolated area of the world could find out a lot sooner than the rest of the people that have managed to survive that if they actually go above the floods subsided and they're actually able to access the surface now, the sun's back out, vegetation is starting to regrow. And if that was the case and that was to happen, and a group of people were to come out first and say, for example, discover they were able to access the surface world for maybe, I don't know, hundreds of years before another sect actually discovered that, hang on a second, let's actually go and check to see if the floodwaters have disappeared and whether we're actually able to go back outside. Upon the discovery of that would conclude and that would account for the fact that the people who came out first would have and be more exposed to the UV radiation at that time on the surface, which would which would allow them to start creating more melanin. And then the people who had stayed within the Earth's surface and underground, their bodies began to turn more and more pale. Their eyes started turning more and more blue to be able to see a lot better in the dark. Their bodies started producing a lot higher amounts of vitamin D naturally, which would, suggest the whole blonde hair, blue-eyed, white, pale skin version of human beings which we believe to be so unnatural to this planet, simply because of the fact that they could have spent so long underground that the mutation was so severe that they turned so white, their eyes turned blue, in order to accommodate for them and adapt them and evolve them to be able to live in this new environment that which they've essentially been left onto, until they found out obviously they can come back outside and begin to explore and come across the fact that, oh, hang on a second, people possibly had already discovered they could come outside because these people here are extremely melanated, which means they've possibly been around here longer than we have. Which, all goes to suggest that quite possibly these changes and differentiation that we see in human beings across the world could be supported by the fact that the whole Noah's flood and story, it was, a scientist with a genetic bank who was able to recreate humanity, the flora and fauna, and re-kickstart nature on Earth. And due to, human error, essentially, as we were made in the image of the creators, so we are able to say that. Something went wrong. People managed to survive the flood. Obviously, the explanation that which I've just gave could have possibly resulted in the differentiation to the skin tones and colours of the races and people that which managed to come out at differing times and in the history of the planet, in order for their leveling and melanation in their skin tones to be at the levels at which they are. I believe this is an extremely important and likely theory. It's something which I don't know if it's been looked at before or been suggested, but personally I've not seen any information pertaining to anything along the lines of this. Everything's been more towards, the whole unknown and scriptural, faith-based ideologies. And like I said, that is no issue to me. I had to agree and be able to coincide with those ideologies first before being able to apply a scientific lens and perspective onto these issues at a later date. So it's extremely important you let me know what you think. Any comments would be massively appreciated. I would love to know what your guys' ideas and thoughts are on this theory of mine. I would love to know if any of you agree, any of you disagree. Any and every bit of debate would be excellent in the comments section. I'll make sure to try and respond to as much as I can. And I thank you very much for listening to me today. This is going to be the end of this podcast. The time is currently 11:22 a.m. on the 31st of March 2023, and this is your host Ali Hagbayan presenting for Aries Media Network. Over and out.